Hello, my name is Rachel Moran, and I wanted to welcome you to the Reimagining the Latinx Experience book talk series. We still have people joining us, but I thought that it would be a good idea to get started just because I know that our panelists today have a lot to present to you. So before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge some of the people who make this series possible. First of all, Dean Austin Parrish here at UC Irvine Law School. We want to thank him for his support. We also want to thank Interim Director Bryant Garth at the American Bar Foundation for support for this series. We also appreciate the help that we get from the UCI Law Centers, especially Robbie Kadri, who helps to do all the technical work to make sure that everything goes smoothly. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge my wonderful research assistant, Elizabeth Schatz-Cordero, who's a student here at UC Irvine Law, because she really helps to identify all the books and put together the schedule and make sure that all of our speakers have a great experience. Now, today, we're going to be hearing from the authors of Afro-Latinos in the U.S. Economy, and then we have the privilege of getting commentary from Dr. Danielle Pilar Clealand. Now, I wanted to let you know that in addition, at the end, you'll have a chance to ask questions. There's a Q&A function, and you can put your questions there, and Elizabeth will be monitoring the Q&A function and posing those questions to our panelists. Before we get started, let me just briefly introduce each of them, beginning with Professor Michelle Holder, who is an associate professor of economics at John Jay College at the City University of New York. She is also a distinguished senior fellow at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Her research focuses on the Black community and women of color in the American labor market, and her economic policy reports have been widely covered in the media. She was named one of the top 19 Black economists to watch by Fortune magazine in 2020. And in addition to her scholarly journal articles, she previously wrote a book on African American men and the labor market during the Great Recession. Her co-author, Alan Aja, is a professor and chair in the Department of Puerto Rican and Latino Studies at Brooklyn College. His research interests include the racial wealth gap, education policy, economic democracy, collective action, and sustainability. Before this book, he also has a publication on Miami's Forgotten Cubans, Race, Racialization, and Local Afro-Cuban Experience. In addition, he consulted on an award-winning documentary called The Sentence by Rudy Valdez. And before joining the Academy, he was a labor organizer in Texas and currently serves on the board of directors for the National Jobs for All Network. Our commentator, Professor Danielle Pilar Clealand, is an associate professor of Mexican American and Latino Studies with a courtesy appointment in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Her work focuses on Black solidarity, struggle, and voice using an interdisciplinary lens. Her research focuses on racial politics in the Caribbean and the United States and draws on her personal experience as a Black Puerto Rican. Her current projects focus on political attitudes and identity among Afro-Latinos in the United States, and racism and Black consciousness in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. She has published her own book, The Power of Race in Cuba, Racial Ideology and Black Consciousness During the Revolution, which won the Best Book Award from the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics section of the American Political Science Association, as well as an award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists as a distinguished book for the year. She's currently working on another project with Devin Spence Benson, which is going to create an oral history of Black Cubans in the United States. So I know we're in for a treat, and I'm going to turn this over now to Professor Holder and Professor Aja.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Moran. I think that I am going to call on Professor Aha, and I just know Professor Aha is Alan, so I'm just going to say Alan all throughout, and, because Alan has graciously agreed to be the slide manager for our little team here. So thank you for that, Alan. So yes, as Professor Moran said, my name is Michelle Holder. And you know, I am here with my co-author, Professor Alan Aha, also Professor Danielle Clealand. I'm simply repeating what Professor Moran said, but let me get into the impetus for this book. So why did Alan and I write this book? So I think in order to explain the impetus, the reason for this book that Alan and I undertook, I should first explain a little bit of who we are. I'm a labor economist who studies the status and position of the Black community and women of color in the American labor market, as Professor Moran said. But I'm also, on my mother's side, a second-generation immigrant. My mother was a Black Latina born in the Central American country of Panama. On my father's side, I'm a descendant of formerly enslaved Africans in America. So if you ask me my race, I will alternately say I'm Black, I'm African American, I'm Afro-Latina, I'm Black Caribbean, etc. I'm all of those. Now, I've always wanted to explore my Afro-Latinx side. So when the opportunity came for me to write a second book, I decided to do it on Afro-Latinxes in the US and their experiences. And there was really only one person that I knew of that was in my immediate circle who I wanted to co-author this book with, and that was Professor Aha, Alan, to work with me. So that's a little bit about why I undertook this project. I'm going to turn it over to Alan, who can also talk about why you decided to undertake this project with me and who you are. Alan?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Holder. And just want to say, this is actually our first, due to COVID, this is actually our first book presentation together. So we really appreciate the invite to be here with us today, to be with you today. Yeah, right. And in terms of how we got here, and I just want to thank my co-author for approaching me a few years ago, said, hey, I've got this project. It's never been done. Economic research is lacking on the Afro-Latinx community. I know you wrote a book. Well, in my own personal background, something I shared in the book is I grew up partly in first years of my life in Little Havana, in the Cuban ethnic enclave, or the white Cuban ethnic enclave during those years, predominantly white. And in the year 2000, I was in Cuba during the infamous, if you will, Elian Gonzalez saga. And I had been there, I was staying with family, and I wondered to myself, and having witnessed racial disparities and economic disparities in Cuba, and this is something Dr. Clealand has written about, and I said to myself, gosh, what if Elian Gonzalez was Afro-Cuban? Would the community in Miami, given the racism there, the long-time mistreatment of Afro-Cubans, as I found in my first book, how would that have been received as well as what would the Cuban government would have done? So I asked those questions. And when I went to graduate school, which was the same school that Michelle and I, the New School for Social Research, we're both graduates of the same institution, I began to think about questions about the ethnic enclave. And in the 1980s, these theories came out that said, hey, these ethnic enclaves, which we thought were these places, these spatial concentrations of where immigrants are exploited, they actually can be good for some groups. Look at Cubans and look at Koreans and look at other groups in the United States. And then I thought, but wait a minute, those theories only are seen through these white Cuban or white Latinx or these privileged lenses. They ignore the Afro-Cuban experience in Florida, so those are questions I carried with me throughout my life, whether it was living in Louisville, Kentucky, or doing international work, and on to graduate school. And I continue to do those here in my position in a Puerto Rican and Latinx Studies department. And I'm going to send it back to Michelle for the next few parts.
Thanks, Alan. And as Alan pointed out, this is the first time we are doing this presentation on our book together. So bear with us as we try to jockey back and forth between each other, but we're going to do our best. So in addition to what Alan said, there are a couple of other reasons which you can see on the screen. There's simply a lack of research on Afro-Latinxes in the field of economics. On the other hand, the social science fields of anthropology, sociology, and political science have really produced a wealth of research on Afro-Latinos. And in addition to that, in a literature review that I conducted prior to undertaking this book, when I knew that I wanted to write about the Afro-Latinx experience in the US, I was unable really to identify any existing economics-oriented texts in the US that deal exclusively with Afro-Latinxes. So I therefore knew that a book like this was needed and could be useful to anyone interested in studying or coming from Afro-Latinxes in America. Now, Alan and I, we also wanted to explore the issues of whether Latinxes are race neutral, and we also wanted to look at how race may or may not matter for Afro-Latinxes in the US. Now, I certainly can't speak for all of Latin America, but I can say that I have felt in this country that there's this notion that Latinxes are race neutral, that they don't see themselves necessarily in this binary black-white framework. This is a notion, but in my lived experience, I would have to say that while this may be the case for a considerable portion of Latinxes in the US, it really is not the case for all Latinxes in the US. Indeed, there appears to be some real reluctance for some portion of the Latinx community to consider themselves Black or of African ancestry, even for those who come from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, where we know the transatlantic slave trade operated for centuries. And according to the research in Alan and my book, the economic evidence certainly suggests that Afro-Latinos are subject to more discrimination in market and other activities in the US compared to those Latinxes in the US who classify themselves as white. And then finally in this book, Alan and I attempt to show that the overall economic experiences of Afro-Latinxes in the US cannot be completely attributed to group to individual level deficits, i.e. the culture of poverty arguments and theories that seek to explain economic disparities, which really rather does dominate, right, mainstream economic theory. And what we find that indeed anti-Blackness in American culture is impacting the Afro-Latinx community in this country. So let me now turn it back to Alan, who will talk about the historical context.
Right. So thanks so much for that. So yeah. So before I'm going to hit on the history, but to actually you did the findings quite well here. Ultimately, what we argue is that Blackness, or rather anti-Blackness, matters, and this isn't simply reduced to these behavioral or these stereotypical, these prejudice that people have against, and particularly employers against folks who are racialized as Black. We also write about how they are structured, how they are embedded, how they are ingrained, right? And we do that throughout our chapters. And part of how anti-Blackness or Blackness matters is we argue that they're vulnerable to anti-Black bias in market activities. And we have a specific chapter that looks at the criminal legal system in the United States as well. Another important finding we found, now this speaks to the difficulties of disaggregated data and having surveys that often don't ask questions in particular orders or where people can see themselves in them. In this case, we had to do a lot of digging with the data. And one of the things that we were able to do is that we took those who identified themselves as Hispanic and Latino, right? There's that question, are you Hispanic, Latino? You say yes or no. Then it asks you to identify your ancestries, right? And then it asks the race question. And by the way, the orders of these questions have flipped around over the years because of non-respondents, right? So there's other history here, which we try to explain with regard to methodology. In short, we found that 20% of the Afro-Latinos in the US that we found in our large sample, right, American Community Survey, report African American ancestry, with mixed African American and Latinx children being a large contributing factor. The next big finding is that about 1/3 of Afro-Latinos in the US report Puerto Rican and Dominican ancestry. And then Michelle is going to show some graphs that show, well, who else is next on that list, right? And how's that work? That is not the same statistic as how many Puerto Ricans or Dominicans report themselves as Afro-Latinx or Black and so forth. So we distinguish that, right? And last but not least, to repeat what Dr. Holder just said, Afro-Latinos, they're the most educated group when you break down the Latinx group by self-reported race. But we make a point that's really important. Education, and I know folks are saying, but you're college professors, what are you saying? What we're saying is this. Of course, it's important, right? Higher ed and so forth. But education is viewed as this panacea in this world while we are diminishing public goods, while we are defunding them and so forth. Public universities, to healthcare, and right, we don't offer that universally. What we are finding, or what we argue, is that education alone does not afford you a better labor market experience. In the case of Afro-Latinx community, it doesn't shield you from race-based material level discrimination. And in the economic theory, you get your education and you're supposed to face these returns, right? In terms of income. We don't find that even in the presence of education. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. All right, so quickly here, I'm actually going to go through this a little bit faster than I thought because I'm looking at the time. What do we use as a historical basis or context? We wanted to pay tribute to the late Miriam Jimenez Roman and Juan Flores. A quick personal note, Juan was a professor of mine when I was doing my doctoral work at the New School. I took a course at Graduate Center, and he was a big influence on my life, as was Miriam, who was the co-editor of the series of my first book. And she and I would go a lot back and forth. We were often disgruntled by the ways in which the mestizaje myth would be used as anti-Blackness. And part of what we do in the beginning of the book is we not only go use the Afro-Latino Reader, which they were editors of, which has this really nice beginning where oftentimes Afro-Latinx history is only situated in the Caribbean or in parts of what is now Central South America. But they brought in historians and sociologists that, hey, what about North America, or what will become the United States? So we use that as foreground, and we bring in that context, not a lot, but but we do as much as we can for the statistical profile. As I said, we critique the role of mestizaje as this concept, this otherness, this beyond black and white that Dr. Holder just talked about. And we really try to just like rip that through and say, wait a minute, when we use those beyond race narratives, we hide anti-Black material discrimination. And we also say that at the same time that anti-Blackness matters, whiteness matters with regard to how Latinos identify within the census. And that gave us a lot of work. Here's what I mean by that, is that when folks self-report their race, right? One may say, well, that's because of the way the question's been asked, or that may say, or that's because of X, Y, Z factor. Actually, there's a lot of research that says that what folks are doing is that they're not actually acting neutral. They're actually choosing a category that hides, right? That is different than what we would call social categorization or social treatment. That makes our job as statisticians, right? As demographers, as researchers, what we have to do is we take the self-reported data and we say, these numbers are inflated versus these numbers, and that this allows us to understand the more material reality. So I'll hand it over to my colleague for the demographic context.
Okay, thank you, Alan. So just to piggyback on what Alan said, I want to talk just a little bit about, and quickly, where the Afro-Latinx community in the US comes from. And as background, there are over 60 million Latinx people in this country, with 60% having Mexican ancestry, 9% having Puerto Rican ancestry, 4% having Cuban ancestry, about 3% Dominican ancestry, and the remaining 24% having ancestries from other countries, with nearly half of these individuals having ancestry from Central American countries, primarily El Salvador. Now, however, with regard to race, while 30%, according to Census Bureau data, while 30% of Latinxes do not classify themselves as either Black or white, fully 66% of Latinxes in the US do classify themselves as white. Comparatively speaking, only a mere 2% of Latinxes in this country, just about over 1 million people, say they're Black. So let's look at the backgrounds of Afro-Latinxes in the US. I believe, Alan, you have the slide up, figure 1.1, or if you don't, could you advance to the next slide for me, please? Okay.
2.1, right? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So as you can see in this chart, about 21.5% of Afro-Latinxes report their primary ancestry as being African American, and I'm going to return to this finding shortly. As you can also see, about 30% of Afro-Latinxes indicate their primary ancestry as being either Puerto Rican or Dominican, both of which are Caribbean islands. And even though the majority of Latinxes in the US are of Mexican ancestry, only 10% of Afro-Latinxes report Mexico as their primary ancestry, and a mere 4% report Cuba, another Caribbean island, as their primary ancestry. Now, on the issue of 21.5% of Afro-Latinxes, regardless of nativity, reporting their primary ancestry as being African American, the interrelationships between African Americans and Latinxes in this country have contributed to this figure. If we restrict this examination to only Afro-Latinxes born in the US, nearly a third of Afro-Latinxes would indicate their primary ancestry as African American. So clearly, the interrelationships between Black Americans and Latinxes in this country is contributing in a very significant way to the Afro-Latinx community in this country. Now, as Alan mentioned before, I want to look at this question of Afro-Latinxes in the US from a slightly different perspective. So Alan, could you advance to the next slide, figure 1.4? Okay, so as you can see from this slide, the title is Proportion of Latinx Subgroups in the US that are Afro-Latinx, meaning what are the groups of the subgroups of Latinx communities in this country most likely to say they are Black? And from this chart, you can see that those with ancestry in either Panama or Belize are the most likely to report being Black. Over 30% of Panamanians and nearly 30% of those from Belize indicate they are Black. Now, on the other hand, only 5.6% of Puerto Ricans and 3% of Cubans, again, both Caribbean islands that were impacted by the transatlantic slave trade, indicate they are Black. Now, as Alan pointed out, this is in contrast to what I mentioned before, right? That a third of Black Latinxes in the US are either Puerto Rican and Dominican. But that speaks to the size of the Puerto Rican community in the United States, which is, I think, over 5 million people. Only 5.6 of them say that they are Black. So there's an issue of size versus relative percentage. Now, in the case of, I'm not sure about the issue with why so many folks from Belize with Belize ancestry report being Black, but I can tell you what the case is with Panama. The explanation there is the Panama Canal. Lots of Caribbean male immigrants, migrants, I should say, including my great-grandfather who left Barbados, headed to Panama early in the last century for gainful work on the canal. And so let me pass it back to Alan to talk about income and wealth among Afro-Latinxes.
Thank you for that. Very quickly here, in a few slides, we're going to talk a little bit about income differences. And I just want to just a series of studies, and we're the first sort of book to look at it as a larger whole. But there's been consistent findings that the Afro-Latinx community yields lower household, which can be anyone in your household reporting income, to personal, and that's the individual being asked, income compared to white Latinas and Latinas as a group, right? And it's important to underscore that when we looked at the Afro-Latinx community compared to African Americans, as in Black, non-Hispanic, non-Latino, right? We found that the Afro-Latinx community looks a lot like African Americans and Native Americans Native communities with regard to economic position, right? That's an important finding, and I'm going to come back to a little bit about what that means in a second. Also, it's important to point out that income, while we talk about it, you're going to see a chart in a second, it's not the same as wealth now, or your assets. And we argued that when you look at wealth, it illustrates a more pronounced racialization of material reality. And so what I'm going to talk about right now is we're going to do a quick sort of link between use home ownership. A lot of our wealth is in home ownership. So we're going to use it as a proxy, and we use it in the book because we didn't have specific data from the American Community Survey that we could do. So we said home ownership is an example of wealth. What do Latinas, what do we look, what do they look like? So what's going on there, right? So here is a quick chart here of the median and mean of home ownership. And I wanted to underscore that our findings are also found at city levels or more localized level. In a report called The Color of Wealth in Miami, which one of our commentator here was a co-author on, we found that even in the present, I'm going to repeat this finding, even as we found that for example, Afro-Cubans and Afro-Colombians had more education than white Colombians and white Cubans, they had lower levels of home ownership, and they were also likely to yield lower home values. So education is supposed to be this predictor, right? But what that speaks to is racial discrimination that they're experiencing in the housing market, in the rental markets, in the buying market, right? So, but these numbers here sort of speak to that very quickly. And at the same time, when we're thinking about, I'll use Miami again as example. In the 1960s, the U.S. government, and this is a point that we wanted to underscore. You're saying, but how is it that groups with similar levels of education can yield these different outcomes? Well, I happen to think or argue that the state matters here. In the 1960s, the U.S. government invested $1 billion into the Cuban refugee program, which included housing assistance, language assistance, right? And part of it was in the Cold War context. And that money, which is necessary for every group should have that right, was limited to a community to ensure there was a lateral mobility or a reproduction of one's economic position as prior to the Cuban Revolution. Questions I ask as a scholar: why wasn't that extended to our Haitian brothers and sisters? Why isn't that similarly extended to Dominicans or Boricuas, right? To our Mexican and Manex? Like, what's going on here? So the state plays a role in these intergenerational differences and in terms of wealth. I'm going to head it back over to Michelle.
Okay, thank you, Alan. So I see that we have limited time left, so I'm going to try to go through this a little bit quickly. On the labor market status of Afro-Latinxes, the main thing I want to point out here is that among all Latinxes in the US, Afro-Latinxes are the most educated group. Alan, if you could go to the next slide, a median educational attainment, table 1.2. And as you can see from that table, the median educational attainment level for Afro-Latinxes is some college, but less than 1 year. Whereas the analogous educational attainment level for either all Latinxes or Latinxes who identify as white is high school graduate or equivalent. But this is concerning because if we go to the next slide, can you advance it, please, Ellen, to figure 3.1 unemployment rates? Thank you. What you see here is that Afro-Latinxes have a much higher unemployment rate, 14.5% during the years 2011 through 2015. That's the years of our analysis, when compared to all Latinxes with an unemployment rate of 10.4% for the same time period, and 9.9% for Latinxes who identify as white. So the supposed panacea, my good friend Alan loves that word, the supposed panacea of education clearly is not paying off for Afro-Latinxes compared to other Latinxes if you look at it from the perspective of labor market outcomes. In addition, like Black Americans and other Latinxes, Afro-Latinxes also tend to be crowded into low-wage industries and occupations in the American labor market. Their wages also tend to fall closer to African Americans than to whites in the US workforce. Although what we find is there is some intra-variation in wages among Latinxes by race. I won't go into that because we don't have enough time. My final words will be on Afro-Latinas. So I'm just going to talk for about 2 minutes. Alan, if you could go to the slide on Afro-Latinas, just the cover slide. Okay, thank you, Ellen. So just a few important observations I want to point out here. Afro-Latinas in the US are a group where multiple forms of marginalization crosshatch, such as gender, race, ethnicity, immigration status, language barriers, and caregiving status. Now, popular assumptions about who Afro-Latinas are and what their productive capacities are have been highly stereotyped. Quiñones Rivera noted that in Puerto Rico, a territory of the US where hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans migrated to the US mainland, primarily New York City after World War II, Afro-Latinas, also known as negras, are stereotyped as women engaged in illegal or low-wage work, i.e. cleaning, selling food at roadsides, prostitution, who live in impoverished, predominantly Black areas such as Loíza. This imagery of Afro-Latinas in Puerto Rico is disturbingly similar to the iconic mammy figure in early 20th century American culture, a Black woman perceived as having low productive capacities in the US economy, relegated to low-wage care work and or housekeeping jobs. The mammy figure arose with enslaved society in the American South. It's noteworthy to point out, however, that the iconic caricatured figures of Mama Inés in Puerto Rico and Mammy in mainland US also share something else in common, very important. They all are indeed working women. Now, perceptions of Afro-Latinas also bear a striking resemblance to another doomed female figure in American 20th century literature and film, the so-called tragic mulatto or mulata, a beautiful, often hypersexualized, light complexion, mixed race Black woman who is unable to successfully navigate either Black or white societies in an era of discrimination and segregation with unfortunate consequences. In US popular media, movies, and television shows, it's rare to find Afro-Latinas represented as such. Black women are presented as either African American or African, and Latinas are typically depicted as non-racialized, as the quote-unquote spicy mama. A contemporary example of this is actor Sofia Vergara's character in the American television series Modern Family, or as possessing European phenotypical attributes. Yvette Modestin, a Panamanian Afro-Latina activist, pointedly noted her disappointment with the extreme lack of Black women in both Spanish language programming on the channels Telemundo and Univision, as well as in the magazine Latina. Now, unemployment rates for Afro-Latinas tend to be higher than other Latinas, which follows a similar pattern of higher unemployment rates for African American women when compared to Latinas in general. Indeed, Afro-Latinas appear to have the highest unemployment rate of all major female demographic groups in the US, with the possible exception of Native American women. Now, high unemployment rates for Afro-Latinas are in stark contradiction to their higher educational attainment compared to other groups, as can be seen in table 4.2. No need to advance, Alan. I'll just say, Afro-Latinas born in the US or who obtain US citizenship have the same median educational attainment as that of white non-Hispanic men or women, which is 1 or more years of college, but no degree. But they have a higher unemployment rate than the latter two groups I just mentioned. Finally, Dr. Marta Morena Vega, founder in 1976 of the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute, pointed out in 2006 that The major problem from her perspective that feeds the racism and sexism Afro-Latinas face is poverty, an enemy of individual and collective agency. As Dr. Moreno Vega noted, poverty, absolutely. Look at the South Bronx, Bed-Stuy, Brazil's favelas, Colombia's slums. Most of what you'll find are people of African descent. Let me pass it to Alan for our final topic. Alan?
Thank you so much. Oh, no. Here it is. We'll be quick. We ended the book with social movements. When we were finishing the book, we were in the middle of we were actually in the edits, in the copy edits, we were in the middle of the pandemic, in the beginnings of the pandemic, and also amid the national uprising to the George Floyd protests. But when we started it was just after the uprisings in Ferguson, Missouri. So that largely informed how we wrote this chapter, those realities, right? And so here's some ideas that we threw out, not all in elaboration in the book, but in terms of how can we reduce the economic disparities and how do we alleviate, how do we challenge? We had some ideas for Afro-Latinx, in terms of immigrants, and it can apply to all immigrants, drop requirements on collective or public goods. Right now, states do that, some cities do that, not all, but we could use progressive examples from around the US. I hope that folks have been able to go on to the Department of Education and apply for the student loan, some cancellation. It's not enough, but that was a result of years of social movements putting pressure on canceling student loan. We need to move to medical, we need to move to other student loan. Reparations, we extend our support for reparations, not just for past, but also current reoccurring harms inflicted onto African American to Afro-Latinx communities across the Americas. We support a Green New Deal for infrastructure and climate policy, jobs can create it here. Paid family and medical leave, this has intersecting contours, right? Also tuition-free college, why are we fighting for, we are fighting for that again. But both Michelle and I teach at CUNY, which used to be free, and yet in the 1970s, when students of color began to apply and be admitted, they found excuses to initiate tuition. Participatory budgeting, democratized work, unions, and perhaps like the country of Chile has done, which they're re-envisioning a new constitution. There was an unfortunate defeat recently, but they're working on it. Maybe that's something that we need to think amid the attack on voter rights, right? And last but not least, I know California is involved in this, something that we're looking at closely in my department and also at CUNY in New York is ethnic studies curricula in the public school system as compulsory. So I'll end it at that.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Holder, Professor Aja. Now we're going to hear from Professor Clealand.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really happy to be able to discuss the book. I'm happy to be part of this conversation. The book is so important to our scholarship, just in our knowledge of Afro-Latinos with respect to the census and other data we have, because we're still working on invisibility, right? And so we're still kind of pushing to get this scholarship out. And so for me, the discussion about the nuances of Afro-Latino identification with regard to subgroup and the emphasis on various institutions and perspectives give us, I think, for the first time, a real thorough look at Blackness and Latinidad in the economy. And we have the numbers, right? We finally have the numbers. We've had them in the census, right? But now they're being analyzed. And so we have access to them. And so I think this is really wonderful. It's a great book. It forwards our scholarship, but also I think the fact that it's so accessible really makes it great for professors to be able to assign and to teach students. I'm teaching a Black and Latinx intersections class next semester, so I'm looking forward to using the book. So I'll make my commentary quick. At the start of the book, the authors talk about who Afro-Latinos are. And I think, you know, we should start there because there are a lot of misconceptions about, who Afro-Latinos are. And while many have both Latino and African-American parentage, right? I'm one of them, right? Dr. Holder's another. I also want to emphasize that Afro-Latinos are here in the US because of the percentage of Black folks in the Caribbean and in Latin America. That's to say, Latinos are Black because Latin Americans and Caribbeans are Black, right? And that should go without saying, but I think that part of the reason there's so little scholarship and discussion about Afro-Latinos is because we still are seeing Latinos as brown rather than this racially diverse ethnic group, many of which identify as either white or Black. And so this issue with Black identification, I think, is really important. Obviously, it limits our ability to make a lot of the comparisons that we want to make, and to kind of draw out the data in the ways that we'd like, because we know that Afro-Latinos are being undercounted. But I think also, while Latinos are not identifying as Black and perhaps distancing themselves from the category, it's important to know that many do not, right? I think what's also happening is that many are associating this Black category on the census with African American, and that is part of this lack of identification, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Afro-Latinos don't still identify with Blackness or feel closer to Black folks than to their own group, than to their own ethnic group, right? Because the pervasiveness of anti-Blackness in Latino communities is real, and it affects, and I think it politicizes identities. And so, my own work looks at this, with my oral history that I'm doing in the 60s and 70s, Black Cubans that came along with white Cubans were left out of the ethnic enclave, not because they didn't want to live there, but because white Cubans kept them out, right? They kept that space as a white space. And so, a lot of those Black Cubans might not mark Black on the census, but they certainly know they're Black and identify with Blackness. And this experience that we see, that the authors point out about Afro-Latinos looking very similar to African Americans is part of that. They're racialized as Black every day. They know, right? That these are similar experiences. And so with that, I was kind of thinking about this kind of Black experience across ethnicity. And so in the book, you talk a little bit about this, or you kind of say it a bit about, African Americans and Afro-Latinos in particular, but I'm wondering if you feel like there is a Black experience across ethnicities. And perhaps this might depend on which indicator we're talking about. Certainly it would apply for wealth, but I'm thinking about other indicators because, I'm thinking about these arguments, as well. I'm also wondering how we can think about Afro-Latinos in relation to other Black immigrant groups. So, when we're looking at Afro-Latinos and levels of education versus income and wealth, does that look the same for non-African American Black folks that are here, right, from either African countries or West Indian countries? Because those are, conversations I think that folks are starting to have. The other thing that I wanted to think about, I thought a lot about the question in the book that asks if we should analyze Afro-Latinos as their own independent group. And so, the comparisons that are made in the book are the comparisons we need, right? Comparing with Latinos and comparing with African Americans. I've just talked about this Black experience across ethnicity. But I also wonder if this is a special group, right? That does require its own independent analysis. And so, obviously through the census data, you begin to answer that, but I'm wondering kind of after writing the book, what you are thinking about that particular question. I was thinking about experiences in the labor market, especially in the discussion about networking. And so if Black Latinos are being othered by non-Black Latinos, if they're also being othered by African Americans because they're not necessarily part of that group, right? And I hear a lot of stories about, I don't fit with African Americans, even though I identify as Black. If they're not in those networks, right, then is that a particular experience on its own? Because a lot of what we're looking at, perhaps not in New York, but in other places, we see that because Afro-Latinos are othered by these two groups at the same time, they are forming their own smaller communities. And so what does that look like as far as their access to the labor market? What does it look as far as, you know, access to networking, and so forth? So those are some of the questions I was thinking about. I don't want to go too long because I want to leave time for the Q&A. I think the last thing I want to say is this importance of cultural proximity that you all talk about as far as Puerto Ricans and Dominicans are concerned, because it's a conversation that I've been wanting to have. And so I'm glad that you finally talked about it. You know, what is happening with Puerto Ricans and Dominicans that they are identifying in such a way? Because there's a lot of nuance here. You know, there's a lot of nuance as far as who identifies as Black. You know, the Panamanian case, I think, has a lot to do, as you said, Dr. Holder, with West Indians and their particular conceptions about Black consciousness that comes from different historical contexts, right, of the West Indies. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of scholarship that shows that they were, the most conscious in the Dominican Republic and in other places in Cuba during the Garvey movement and all of that, right? So they're providing a different perspective within this community. And then Puerto Ricans and Dominicans growing up in New York, what does that mean for their identities? What does it mean to grow up around, other African Americans and be sharing the same spaces, right? Because, as I grew up in New York as Puerto Rican, we were all together, right? Black people, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, we were all hanging out together, listening to the same music, sharing the same languages, all of that. So anyway, you don't have to answer all those questions, but those were some of the main ideas that I was thinking about. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you again for writing this book. Thank you for having me, and we can move to the next segment.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Clealand, for those very helpful comments. They give us a lot of food for further thought. I wanted to give our authors a chance to respond, but also we do have a question and answer function. We really welcome your submitting your questions, and we have one question already that I want to make sure we have time to answer as well. So perhaps what we could do is, if you wanted to respond to Dr. Clealand's commentary, then we'll pose the question that we have. Perhaps that's a good way to proceed.
Alan, do you want to go?
Sure, I'm sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Clealand. Yeah, you bring up issues that we need. That I go back and I look at the book and I said this should have been clearer, or this, or we hinted this, and how do we sort of how do we delve? For instance, your notion of like, is there an experience across groups? And we explored that with the Miami Color of Wealth report, which we found these asset disparities were across different Black groups, whether Bahamian, Jamaican, to Afro-Latinx, to African American. And I think that we underappreciate those kinds of findings in the literature. There might be some variation here and there, home ownership to other assets, loans, and so forth. But in terms of creating that sort of a cross-group experience, I think that we highlight some of that, but now you're giving ideas. I know you're exploring this for future projects. What else? I have some notes here. Dr. Holder, do you want to?
Sure, Alan. I mean, I just have to say, Dr. Clealand, I absolutely love your point about, as Alan just delineated, this kind of across, these groups, like sort of across them, a sort of Black culture, right? That we all share. And I wish you and I knew each other growing up, because I share with you exactly the same experience that you outlined, which is when I was growing up, as a, Black woman, Afro-Latina, whatever you want to call it, it was, me and those like me, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. And we all just kind of considered each other really sharing one kind of culture, outlook, world perspective that was certainly, right, a shared reality grounded in our African ancestry. So I think your point is well taken, that we could even explore that further. So Alan, I guess, this is for you and me to start to think about the follow-up project, and maybe Dr. Clealand would be willing to come along for that ride.
Real quick here, Dr. Clealand, your point about white Cubans excluding Black Cubans, that was in the interviews I had done early on for my first book project, that came up in every single interview. There wasn't one where someone said, well, we came, we were, we went through the refugee center for the office, we went to Little Havana, and they did not rent to us, or they did not hire us. And in our last chapter on discrimination, we talk about that broadly, but we need more books from around that do more localized and tell people stories outside of the statistical disparities.
Elizabeth, did you want to go ahead and pose the question that we had?
Yes, yeah. So the question is about how this work and this type of work, the research on the economic status of Afro-Latinxes, has been received. In particular, Dr. Holder recently had a very high profile role leading an important DC research and grant-making institution. What was it like working in Washington at the center of policy-making conversations while approaching your work and life with a commitment to centering Afro-Latinxes and centering racialization and government policies creating racial hierarchy?
Thank you for that question, for posing the question, Elizabeth, that Stefan Lefebvre, who Alan and I know very well, and I'm very happy to see you here, Stefan, and supporting us. To your question, Stefan, what I found in that role that I had the last year was that there really any sort of interest in talking about the positionality of Black people in the US was really never about or even adjacent to Black Latinxes. So when I would be in these policy discussions, policy debates, talking about, issues with regard to discrimination against African Americans, Black Americans, Latinxes, the conversations would always be in a sort of binary, in that it was about Black and white people. And if, Latinxes were folded into the discussion, there was never a question or assumption on the side of the other table about where our Afro-Latinx is situated. So it was really hard for me to find an opening in a lot of these discussions to bring in the perspective, concerns, issues, and challenges that the Afro-Latinx community faced, because there was really, almost this laser focus on what is affecting the Black American community, singularly and solely, as opposed to the broader Black collective in the US. So I would say, in answer to your question, it was pretty challenging. And I think that certainly at the federal level, sort of awareness that, the Black collective in the US is not simply African American, or, that's a difficult wall to break through. A lot of these, high level policy discussions, decisions, et cetera, really still center around this kind of binary or trinary, I know that's not a word, kind of, a setup where it's Black, white, Latinx, maybe Asian, and no gray areas, no sort of Venn diagrams, no cross hatches in between. So, yeah.
Real quick, speaking of cross hatching, if I may, can I tie these 2 points together? That question, and Dr. Clealand, your previous point about can we create these specific sort of ask these questions that are group specific? I think of this in my research on the crimmigration system in the United States. Black immigrants are the most likely to be deported. They're most likely to be racialized, discriminated against, brought through the criminal injustice system, right? Legal system. And then in terms of relative to other immigrant groups, that the data is there. The data, that is an obvious reality. However, the state apparatus isn't set up to ask questions that would help us identify particular Afro-Latinx communities. Now there's another article there.
Great. And I just wanted to note, I think Dr. Clealand had also mentioned that this is a regional issue. And we've commissioned white papers on the demography of Latinos in the United States. And one of the things that was clear from the work that Doug Massey and Amelie Constant did is that race is a much more significant factor in the Northeastern region because it's a more significant, palpable barrier to mobility. And that, for example, here in the Western region, it's really undocumented status that's seen as the bigger barrier to mobility. And I didn't know if you thought that that regional constellation of Afro-Latinx is likely to have any impact on how these policy concerns get resolved.
That's a good question. So when I think of your question, I think of there's been work done on Afro-Latinx community, particularly Afro-Cubans who have been resettled in the Southwest. And I believe the researchers of those articles asked sort of a very similar question, is that are there legal constructs that are context specific that hide the anti-Blackness that we need to get at through our, not just our questioning, but also through our activism and our collective action. So I don't know if that answers your question, but in the same way that asset variation can be localized, for example, the color of wealth, there's actually a color of wealth report on Los Angeles, and it looked at disaggregated Asian groups and Latinx groups in the region and found disparities and all kinds of sort of nuances. So I don't know if that gets at what you're getting at with regard to clearly not a legal scholar here, but I think that it begs some questions whether the way that we categorize, right, public policy speaking, doesn't account to allow us to sort of expose the larger racialized reality, which is, I think, is what we're getting at.
Well, there's so much more to say, but unfortunately, we were getting near the end of our hour together. So I just wanted to make sure we had time, first of all, to thank Professor Holder, Professor Aja, and Professor Clealand for what I think has been a very provocative and generative dialogue, even coming up with potential future research projects as we were speaking. And I also did want to highlight our upcoming talks in the series. We will be hearing from Cecilia Munoz on her book, More Than Ready, on November 2nd at 12 noon Pacific. She was a member of the White House under the Obama administration, and she has some wonderful stories to tell from her time in that job, as well as her work as a nonprofit advocate. And I think she has also some very wise advice for people who are struggling to make a difference and need to stay the course. So I hope you'll join us for that. And then our last talk for the fall series will be with Tanya Hernandez, and her book, which I think really dovetails nicely with this conversation, is on racial innocence, unmasking Latino anti-Black bias and the struggle for equality. That will take place on November 16, also at 12 noon Pacific, and we will be having Enid Trucillo-Haynes as our commentator. So I very much thank you for joining us today, our authors and commentator, for a lively discussion, and hope to see you at a future book talk. Thank you.